All right, movie macro number 2. We're going to be discussing Roman Polanski's 1974 film, Chinatown. As you can see, it's Keith and I again. We just came from a ramen lunch. We just finished watching the movie. You could still see some of the hot sauce on his face. You could see some of the internal smile on mine.
Do I?
A little bit.
Why don't you fucking
well, maybe it's, I don't know, it could be razor burn as well.
Probably both.
All right, well, you could keep, you just keep rubbing your face. So progressively, you're gonna look better and better for the audience.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, this was an interesting film, right? I first saw it maybe like 5-6 years ago, and it seemed at the time a bit too convoluted. Maybe because now with the gift of hindsight, right? I know what the plot is, so it feels less convoluted. But that felt better for me. And overwhelmingly, I would say it's a good film. I definitely see reasons why it would be considered a classic, right? I see why it would be considered sort of quotable, even if some of the quotability is, perhaps a scene that you have to describe as opposed to necessarily always a snatch of dialogue. But I feel like some of the individual parts of the film I've seen done better, right? Just like by other filmmakers, right? So like one big one is in Chinatown we have the ending itself, right? And the ending is something that reminds me of Kobayashi's Hara-kiri, right? Because in Hara-kiri at the end, in this almost kind of like fascist like takeover of history, right? Might makes right, that sort of thing. They try to completely rewrite what happened in that house, right? They don't want to admit to any sort of wrongdoing, right? They want to essentially rewrite history, and you definitely get the sense, right, in your life that this historically has happened so many times before, right? Just as Kobayashi sort of does this in this, almost like abstracted way, we have a similar thing going on in Chinatown, right? Where at the very end we have Jake, the protagonist, and we have what's the name of the father?
Noah Cross.
Oh, Noah Cross. Yeah. So we have Noah Cross, and Noah Cross, despite being shot, he seems to suddenly survive. Right? You don't expect that. That's a kind of like flip of the script. He ends up grabbing his granddaughter, right? After it seems like raping his daughter, right? This is now his granddaughter as well, just like this is his daughter's daughter. He still grabs his daughter. He's able to sort of get away with it. It seems like there's going to be some kind of cover up, right? So and that is also very, very memorable, right? Mm-hmm. But lots of sort of like individual components. I felt like were done better in other films, whether it's like Kobayashi or whether it's like even just the handling of the whole kind of like Chinatown theme, right? I feel like there's a similar dynamic going on a little bit in films like Killing of the Chinese Bookie, where Chinatown or Chinatowns or this like other, it starts to like represent something existential, metaphysical, but it's not really fleshed out here at all. Right. Whereas in Chinatown, like you have the race. Like here, you don't even have too much of a racial dynamic going on. Like in Chinatown, you have the Italian gangsters who feel like they're on the way out, right? And they say stuff like, "Oh, look,
Killing of a Chinese Bookie, man."
Yeah. Sorry, in Killing of a Chinese Bookie, they feel like we're Italian gangsters, we're on the way out, and they say things like, these Chinese Americans, they don't know whether they're Chinese Americans, American Chinese, they're just projecting their own kind of insecurities. Here, I feel like the metaphor, while it exists, it's a lot more vague. And by being vague, I mean, all that vague means is it's not really developed, right?
Yeah, no, it's supposed to represent also something more psychological inside of the protagonists of this movie. The protagonist of this movie, Jake Gittes, played by Jack Nicholson in a performance I would call like good, not great. I wouldn't put it in like the top tier of Jack Nicholson performances. The whole thrust of the movie is that he used to be like a detective assigned to the Chinatown beat, and he has a lot of guilt and trauma surrounding, I guess, sort of a directive from the department to look the other way with respect to a lot of the organized crime and black market stuff that was done in Chinatown, seemingly under kind of the supervision of the police department, maybe just a way of keeping track of it. And somebody that he was trying to help out of a bad situation got killed, or at least got harmed in some way. I guess they don't specifically say killed, but it's kind of implied. At the very least, something bad happened to somebody he was trying to help. So he has left the police force and he's become a private detective. He's very, very alienated. You know, he sort of professionally ruins people's lives by photographing their partners, cheating on them. We see the consequences of that later in the movie, where the wife of a woman whose affair he exposes at the beginning of the movie answers the door when he knocks on it, and she's got a big black eye, implying that it's become like a domestically abusive relationship in the wake of the work that he did. But he...
Well, I mean, she abused him first in that sense.
I
mean, she cheated on him. I'm joking.
I was gonna say, yeah.
My arm is just getting really tired, so I'm just trying to get a little energy. Damn.
Yeah.
We should get a tripod for next time we do this.
Yeah, that would probably be better than just holding the phone.
Yeah,
like
people
this.
getting
Although
drunk.
it's a funny camera angle, so it's unique in that way.
Yeah.
No, but anyway, what I was saying is, like, Chinatown sort of represents like the thing that has alienated him from humanity, and the thing that drives him to try to hold people at a distance, which is something that he does throughout the movie, and to be kind of mistrustful, and to kind of always second guess people's motivations and stories. And he sort of lets that go in pursuit of possibly a relationship with the Faye Dunaway character, but then at the end of the movie, she is hiding out in Chinatown, and that's where she's killed, and the person pulls him away and says, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown, sort of implying that probably he's, maybe forever gonna just sort of like enclose himself, like this is maybe the last burst of humanity that he had, and this woman that he kind of cared about and was trying to help out of a bad situation was shot in front of him, just like presumably some version of happened in the past. And so, I mean, either at some point someone says you never learn, and he says, I guess I don't. So maybe it's either implied that he just sort of has something in him that is going to like self-destructively pursue this kind of dynamic. But I would take it more as like, I mean, if he was driven away from his what it presumably would have been like a pursuit of good or a pursuit of public service by what he witnessed in Chinatown the first time, I would assume that what happened here probably would complete that act of severing, that act of psychically amputating himself away from the rest of the human race and just kind of profiting and living a small and somewhat barren existence as like a leech on the psychic pain of others. Yeah, but it's just it just doesn't. It's like you said, it just doesn't. It doesn't cohere into something larger exactly. I mean, to the extent that something larger is happening in this film, it's more so the relationship, like the sort of parasitic relationship between like urban areas and like outlying suburbs and rural areas. Like
that's an interesting dynamic that we talk about.
That is something that is like actually kind of geographically fleshed out. And then like the Chinatown, Chinese diaspora, Chinese immigrant aspect to it feels it almost feels like something that maybe was more fleshed out in like an earlier draft of the script, but that's kind of the way it stayed because they liked the focus on like Jake's psyche or whatever, but it doesn't really work because, to be honest, Jake Gittes is not that well fleshed out of a character in the movie. He's actually got pretty simple psychology and pretty simple motivations most of the time. So it's not really maybe the direction that the movie should have gone in. It should have probably fleshed out the political dynamic of things more, because that's kind of where there was really something going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's like a few things to talk about there. So, like, just just watching this movie, I immediately just got the sense of, these are kind of like the sort of like proto-Trumpists right? At the time, right? This is kind of like any group.
He's referring specifically to the farmer characters.
Yeah, to the farmer characters. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. They're proto-Trumpists in the sense that they're essentially any group at any. Well, and you don't have to use Trump, right? There's other examples of this in the past, but generically now, right? This is the way that would be understood. They're just any group at any given time that is, by happenstance, it's less fortunate, more menial sort of labor, right? More on the outskirts, disconnected, culturally different. And there's also a city, right? There's Los Angeles, and it's growing. It has its needs, and people today, they say stuff all the time like they make fun of red states by saying like, well, the blue states, just completely, pay for everything that you got, right? They pay the higher taxes, you get all this infrastructure that you then vote against, blah, blah, blah. And, there's obviously something to that critique, right? I think the system has to be dysfunctional, right, for people to continue to critique each other, right, from one sort of like conglomerate versus the other. But despite the fact that there's some, I guess, a truth to that critique, these are the people that they have your water supply, right, on the other side. The red states, they grow your food, right? They provide so many important services, usually at a greater net cost to them than the benefits that you receive, right? And you're saying, in exchange, you're just going to give them a little bit of welfare, right? And that is sufficient, right? Welfare that, by the way, that because of where things are historically, culturally, they're simply going to vote against it, right? So you have the same kind of dynamic playing out here. Like if you read about the California water wars, right? Like some farmers did well, right, by receiving this, by selling their land, but others did not, right? And the fact is, like, there's always losers in these kinds of scenarios, and they either go extinct as they sort of have done here, right, in America, or they sort of metamorphose into like something completely different, by the time that politically it's ripe, right? So anyway, that's just what I thought first.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting though, because like,
and by the way, that part is also not really fleshed out or developed.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
I just said all this stuff. I'm giving you my interpretation. This is not something that's really fleshed out in any way in the film, right? It's just kind of there as a backdrop, which it has its own set of interest if people do things in that way, but with combination of so many other things being undeveloped, like it just feels like this is just another sector that's not fully fleshed out,
Yeah, well, this is a film that is often said to have one of the greatest screenplays of all time, to have like a perfect screenplay. And from a Hollywood kind of perspective, which is funny because this comes out of New Hollywood, where directors are allowed to, really pursue their art and really pursue something more idiosyncratic than a homogenized studio vision. But from a just pure classic Hollywood perspective, while it content-wise goes beyond what would have been allowable under the Hays Code in an earlier era, it really is just a very Hollywood script. And from that perspective, it is a pretty rock solid script. There's a mystery at the center of it. It sort of trickles out over time. I think one could say that the eventual death of the Faye Dunaway character is pretty fucking predictable. But the actual, like, what is going on in the mystery is sort of doled out in small pieces at a time, to where, you sort of figure out what's going on at approximately the same rate as the main character, and you get little entertaining asides that kind of tell you about, the various characters of the people involved. You have hard-boiled, dialogue with like some pretty good jokes here and there. So in terms of the things that like Hollywood would prioritize in order to make like a saleable commodity, something that is going to probably attract a lot of tickets purchased, yes, it is an excellent script. But in terms of like the whole history of the screenwriting medium and all that has been achieved with that by people like Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, Woody Allen, Ingmar Bergman, all these kinds of people, it's it's fine. It's like a solid 75-80 kind of movie. It's not it's not in the top tier of cinema, and it's not even in the top tier of American cinema of the 1970s. You know, it is. So, I mean, the fact that it is pretty, in some ways, not quite lowest common denominator, but like middlebrow, I guess is kind of the term. You know, the fact that it's like pretty middlebrow and it still holds up pretty good in 2022 is a credit to it. Yeah. But it never really rises above being middlebrow either. You know, it never really rises above being just, you know, kind of a good. We didn't have any popcorn, but if you had some popcorn, you have a good time watching it. Yeah. You know,
and I mean, also sort of at the center of it is that melodrama of, you know, he's, you know, she's my daughter and also my sister because my father raped me, right?
Yeah.
That is also something that, like, I can imagine critics would say something like, well, this gives it this like super powerful Oedipal quality to it, blah blah. But it's like it wouldn't like that's not really expressed other than he wants to see who is, you know, his in the sense like illegitimate daughter, and he wants to, you know, rewrite history. So it's like the prototypical example of like an evil sort of man, right? But beyond that, like adding this like Oedipal texture, it doesn't do anything because it's not really played with. I mean, he doesn't, you know, he doesn't behave in this kind of like otherwise fashion. If the point is we are depicting an evil person who's done these bad things, who is capable of doing bad in the future, you know, that is a kind of like throwaway kind of layer to it. I mean, you didn't even need. You didn't need, you know, that kind of melodrama to unfold for that sort of ending to do exactly what it needs to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it really could have been shorter too. Honestly, I mean, what was it, about 2 hours and 10 minutes, something like that?
A little over 2 hours.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel longer than that, but it does feel that long.
Because it's technically well done, so it doesn't feel long, right? You sort of want to see the next scene or the next connection. But
it's also not. I mean, it's not like fantastic visually, you know. I mean, it's pretty good, especially the way that it does like old-timey Hollywood style cinematography with like in color. You know, like the way that the camera is like fixed on the back of the car when he's driving, or the use of the iris that looks like binoculars when he's looking at someone in the valley, which is not something you see as much anymore. You know, like there is things to commend about it, but it's not even like aesthetically I mean, the soundtrack is excellent, although it's a little melodramatic at times. Even then, you know, it's got an amazing main theme, and there are times where it's really quite good, but there's also times where like it's clearly indicating kind of how you're supposed to feel, or how the main character is feeling, or how they're about to feel, because it's signaling that danger is coming or something like that. So, you know, just like even aesthetically, it's not like transporting you into the film, and the story itself, while it is competently told in terms of what it is, it's not like, you know, there's like such depth, or these are such sparkling characters, or there's so much of interest happening that you're really kind of losing yourself the way that you would watching like you know, like the best of like a Werner Herzog movie, or, you know, like I said earlier, an Ingmar Bergman movie or something like that. You know, it's just it's a pleasant sit.
Yeah. I mean, to get more specific into like some of these issues, right? I think we talked about beforehand the Evelyn character, right? So Evelyn Cross is, I mean, she's clearly, you know, like a major sort of vehicle, and you know, she's important for the film, and yet, oddly enough, like as a character, right, she's not really developed. She's very dependent on this kind of, you know, how like another example of like a movie that does some of these individual elements better, you know, Lady from Shanghai, also, you know, film noir, and also you know, sort of uses this idea of the exotic, right, and the different to just create, you know, just kind of like another world, right, that follows its own kind of internal logic, right? Like I feel like, especially in the past, like some of these like Asian sort of themes, landscapes, whatever, they're used to, not in necessarily even offensive ways. I mean, like, again, you know, Chinese Bookie does it in a way that really shows the dysfunctional psychology of the Italians, right? And all these characters, right, they have somewhat like dysfunctional psychologies, right? So It's not, anyway. So, but when Lady of Shanghai does this, right, there's simply much more to work from. Whereas here, like you said earlier, the motivations that she has aren't necessarily all that clear. She, like you said, serves the paper soon that he's going to get sued, and then just as quickly she rescinds them, right? And it just gets more and more convoluted. Some of the action that gets taken by all characters, right, but her as well, it's just not logical. It's there to simply move the plot along, right? And
there's way too much dumbest possible action kind of writing in this for it to really be as great as people say. I mean, just two examples. Well, first, Jay Gittes, the main character, at one point he goes to investigate the reservoir, but this is someplace that he already suspects that a murder has taken place, and yet he's showing up here in the middle of the night, even though he has guys that work for him, that could come with him and provide him backup, but he's showing up there alone. And that's when he gets his nose slit with a knife early on in the movie, and he spends much of the rest of the movie with a bandage on his nose, which is actually a nice visual, like a slight subversion of like the ultra masculine, good looking, hard boiled noir main character. But you can kind of excuse that as like, okay, that's when he learns that there's something dangerous going on, and he should be smarter from then on out. But then at the end of the movie, he calls Noah Cross, the main villain, I guess you could say, of the movie, to Faye Dunaway's house, presumably to try and, I guess, provide her with some cover to potentially get away. But, again, he's got I guess he sent them to see, but he's inviting him to this house by himself with, again, no backup. He doesn't even seem to have a firearm on him.
I mean, he knows that this guy is
he knows this guy is
psychopathic.
At this point he knows that he is like a disgusting, like, old European aristocrat, like inbred, level of like evil, powerful person, and yet come here to this big secluded house where if you do something to me, then nobody will ever know.
He's just like ex-cop. He shows up without a gun. He's and like you said earlier when we first talked about, like, what is his plan exactly? What does he expect to happen? What does he want to happen?
Well, I guess since we discussed that, I've sort of pieced together, like, he had sent his guys there. He had sent the weird Italian guy who beat his wife that he humiliated at the beginning of the movie to, like, drive her across the border into Mexico. And he said, if I don't show up by 8:30, then, go ahead and just take her, even if I don't show up. I just won't say goodbye to her. So it's like, okay, but
what if he gets murdered? I mean, it's like, okay. It still doesn't explain, like, why isn't he afraid of, like not even afraid, but like, why is he not?
Well, no, here's where the incoherence comes in. You could maybe say that he feels guilty about the person that he got hurt earlier in his life and career, and so he's willing to sacrifice himself in order to provide a cover for her, to distract him so that his goons that are presumably out looking for them.
So if you're going to die anyway, get a gun and kill that guy.
There's also that, but then, like, doubly, if he was, like, okay, so what was, if his plan was to sacrifice himself, then why, when he gets gun pulled on him, does he take them to where she is hiding? That's also what I have trouble understanding exactly,
because at that point he would then feel like, well, I might get killed now, I have to, like, not play around. But it's like he was playing around the whole time, this ex-cop that's been doing this line of work for so long,
it's like
and reached the top, right? That's the other weird part.
Either his plan was to distract him and be willing to sacrifice himself, and then he pussed out, to use a vulgar term, or he didn't have a plan, in which case this whole ending sequence is built on, like, just the dumbest possible action that he could take, which is advertising to the most powerful and evil person that we've seen in this movie that exactly where the person that he's looking for is, when he, I assume he has guys in a lot of places, but and we found out earlier in the movie that he has people around town that keep him informed, even though he's kind of a private, secluded person now.
Yeah.
But like, he doesn't have people everywhere. Like you could, especially like in a fucking like like broken down pickup truck. Like you could probably hide 2 women in there until you get out of town.
Yeah.
And get them across the border or whatever. So just kind of a lot of, I'm going to walk into this clearly dangerous situation with no plan and no weapon, kind of stuff propelling the plot. And so when you see people say that this is like one of the best scripts ever, it's like, well, I mean, I guess Hollywood has to have people behave stupidly in order for things to proceed in the way that a Hollywood movie would proceed, because Hollywood is a stupid oversimplification of life where people have to have simplified psychologies in order for the 3-act structure, the classics, save the cat a method of writing a script to be like a valid interpretation of reality.
Yeah. I often just couldn't help but thinking as I was like listening to the script, like even if a lot of it is well written, as far as like its sort of individual thing that it tries to do, there are better, somewhat humorous perhaps film noir, preceding this film, after this film, right? With better like kind of let's call it hard-boiled scripts.
Yeah.
Like a lot of Orson Welles, for example, is like that. But there's also just a lot of books are like that. Like when I think about the grittier parts of Irwin Shaw's stories, like the grittier stories when he has people in these kinds of either a mob adjacent or cartel adjacent or like whatever type of environments. There's a much more kind of like poetry and density to a lot of that dialogue, right? Even when you look at maybe the more comedic side of things, like I think Woody Allen's Curse of the Jade Scorpion has one of the best sort of comedy gumshoe scripts like ever, right? Granted, that doesn't say a whole lot because that kind of like sort of farce, oddball kind of almost like well, I guess it's only like semi slapstick over there, but that kind of genre does have a certain kind of ceiling, but at its own individual thing, it sort of does a better job, right? But then you have like straight books, sort of like this, like Mickey Spillane's novels. A lot of that, even some of those setups, like seem more memorable to me, right? Then so if you were to go basically line by line, right, which is kind of like a film though should not only sometimes at least be able to go line by line, but if it's not doing that, maybe there needs to be some kind of like poetry underneath it, right, that is more exposed, that is allowed to unfold, and that has these like wider reverberations within like the characters in the movie. That's kind of the important thing,
like
right?
a larger,
it has to reverberate within so it can reverberate without, right?
Yeah, like a larger philosophical view or idiosyncratic worldview on the part of the artist making it or whatever, something that because like it's not that hard to write like hard-boiled dialogue or whatever. So I mean, the fact that it's like pretty serviceably good in this movie is not like intrinsically impressive in and of itself, and compared to something like The Third Man, where there's like a real cynical realpolitik kind of point of view that comes through a lot of the hard-boiled and clever dialogue in that movie. In comparison to something like that, Chinatown falls a little bit flat. Which is not to say that it's bad. Like it's weird sometimes when you talk about stuff vis-a-vis stuff that is superior to it. It sounds like you're saying that it's like not good in particular work, and it's good in this work. It's just like it's good, but still overrated.
I'm rattling off explicitly though, like tons of like great films, right? So it's kind of like an unfair comparison to begin with, right? But I'm not trying to call this a bad movie, but going into it, from what I recall, it did seem like, given its reputation, it would be kind of overrated. And I'd say that it's kind of overrated, even if you could say in so many respects it is well done. Yeah. Right.
I think it's more than kind of overrated. I mean, I would just say that it's like flat out. I mean, I think it was like in the AFI top 100 or whatever. It's pretty high, or at least it used to be pretty high on the IMDb top 250. And it's not really in that caliber I wouldn't say, but
Well, like, I'm sure if you would look at so many other things in the top 100, it would be, a lot of it would be far worse trash.
well, yeah, but I mean, just thinking about like, if you were to name like 250, paragons of human achievement in the art of cinema, if this would make it, I would think it would be on the low end of that, and I would suspect that it probably wouldn't. But I wonder, I mean, it's interesting to think like why this got the reputation that it did in the first place, but then I'm thinking like,
You did say some of the reasons, though. I feel like you already mentioned them implicitly.
Well, but also just thinking like about kind of the stuff that gets Oscar nominations and Oscars now, and something that is a throwback to an earlier era, it kind of always has a certain appeal, especially if it's like self-consciously like an artful version of that thing that was, especially like film noir was, until it got revitalized by a lot of the French Academy or the Cahiers du Cinéma people in France. It was kind of considered like, like pulpy, low rent kind of stuff at the time that it was being made. And so, after it kind of got rediscovered or whatever, this is like a self-consciously more artful attempt at something like that with overt political overtones and blah, blah, blah. But even nowadays, when something is like revitalizing a genre or an earlier era, like it seems to always kind of get a certain amount of buzz. I think of something like The Artist that came out like 10 years ago, where, I mean, nowadays I haven't heard, it wasn't a bad movie, but it wasn't a great movie either, but you don't even hear about it nowadays.
Yeah.
But it was something that was self-consciously like trying to be a silent movie. And that, there is something about like the valorization of past eras of cinema that has like a certain appeal to, especially, I mean, just think about it, Academy voters in almost any era tend to be older. They tend to have had a career in the cinema for a while, and so something that comes back and sort of validates work that they might have done, in an earlier era, like, no, it's not dated, it's not obsolete, it's not the dustbin of history, like here it is, new and revitalized in the flesh or whatever, that sort of gives it a nostalgic appeal to the kind of people that are going to be making these kinds of decisions about what does and does not go in the awards at the end of the year or the canon at the end of the decade or whatever.
Yeah. I will say that the soundtrack, it is fairly, like, I don't know how long it is if I were to like type in the Chinatown OC into YouTube, but there are some, the soundtrack is pretty good. The fact a lot of the sound is just kind of in the background works, I think, to its favor. But sometimes it's also just kind of like telegraphing too much, right, too soon, right? Some of the more kind of, to the extent that Chinatown has oftentimes like some melodrama, right, that is not, it's just, when you said like, well, why is it considered such a classic? Some of the reasons that you or I talked about, like it has that melodramatic quality. It's convoluted enough for people to have like that sort of pleasure of uncovering the secret little by little, or the secrets little by little, right? Those things could stay with you. The fact that, technically speaking, much of the script is well written, many of the lines are sort of memorable. These are things you can imagine, like guys like quoting to each other, all those things. And also, like, there is that at least a desire for a poetry to be underneath it all, like connecting the characters, connecting everything, right? And there is like some poetry underneath it all, but it does not connect the characters. It doesn't, unfold any sort of deeper substances. It's just kind of, it is made to be there. It is put there. It doesn't have too much of a kind of deeper function.
Yeah, it's I don't know what else is there to say about it, really.
And then, I mean, that all makes it much easier to talk about, I think.
Yeah, it's very digestible. Like it's a very It's almost like the cinema equivalent of like that bowl of ramen that we had right after we saw it.
Yeah. It wasn't very, like I was telling Keith, like whenever I eat anywhere, I try to eat out or order, as little as possible, simply because I mean, first of all, it's like very expensive, right? But beyond that, it's just the food usually is just not good, right? There's only a few places that are legitimately good. Especially if like you want to cook your own food, you quickly find that most things just aren't, they're not the best ingredients, the taste just isn't good, like it's kind of like mass produced, so it wasn't very good ramen. And again, going back to, well, why was the ramen place rated a 4.7? Well, the same reason why this probably has like a 9 point something on IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes or whatever it might be, right? You have, for example, that edible edge. If you want to simply, by fiat say, that's edible, that's it. You put that in the checklist, you check that box, you move on to the next element, and you will find, these little, elements that you could focus on each time. The question that I'm asking is, are they necessary for what's actually going on? Do they reveal anything more other than superficiality? And finally, are they just an excuse to not characterize things, right? Because the characterization here, it's good enough to propel a story, and it's good enough to make the film memorable, but it's characterization in the same way that maybe like Woody Allen's Broadway Danny Rose has characterization, right? There is more depth here, there's more symbolism here, but it's you can't just depend on this is a hard-boiled guy, this is a hard-boiled woman, this is how these two dysfunctional people function together, right? And here's we're going to take away the possibility of a romance. But it is interesting though how you don't truly know what transpires, right?
Yeah.
You have these suspicions, and you can make arguments in that direction, but a lot of it is like what was Evelyn's involvement in all this really, right?
Yeah.
That's an open possibility, and you can't simply shut it and say that's not, because those are the things that can be discussed, right?
Yeah.
And they do lend some depth to the character somewhat, but there are many more opportunities that were not taken.
Yeah, well, the thing with the Evelyn character, like in some ways she is kind of emblematic almost of the entire movie, because the fact that you never quite understand her motivations is a positive for the film. Like the fact that you, like Giddy's, are at the end of the movie, are kind of left wondering, like, why exactly did she do what she did? Why did she try and get close to me? Why, what really drove her to participate in this unfolding of events in that way? It really does put you in kind of his frame of mind that he's probably going to have to live with for a long time. And so that's a positive. But at the same time, when you actually really start like picking it apart, it's like, okay, so she came to him to serve him a lawsuit for claiming that she had hired him, but when she didn't, it was we find out later it was a prostitute that had been hired by Noah Cross, the businessman and partner of the local town water manager, and so she comes to serve him a lawsuit, but then he comes to her and she instantly drops the lawsuit, like, so presumably she was like put up to it to discredit him or to to shade something. And then her husband dies, and then we find out later maybe he died at the house, and she claims not to know about it, but then it's like, well, were you at the like when you really try to like dissect her motivations, it's not so much that like they're mysterious as it is that they're a little convoluted and incoherent. Yeah. And so that's not really like it is a memorable characterization, and it does kind of stick with you a little bit, but it's more sleight of hand than depth. Yeah. It's like grasping at depth, but the ball is kind of leaving the hand and going into the sleeve. Yeah. It's not actually going where you can see it or where you can take it home with you.
Yeah, to the extent that you could have like character vagueness as a positive, as something that is like potentially like poetic in a movie. you also run the risk, which in this case, this is what in fact transpired. You also run the risk by making a somewhat vague character of having those things like, incoherent motivations. Like you have to, because you are sort of pushed along by the internal vagueness, right? Or rather, you're pushed along by the unfolding events, right? Which means that the vagueness is sort of made to accommodate it at every step, right? And it makes the character just feel less real, right? If you have events that are forced to, characterize someone as opposed to these like a set of responses. They don't even have to be like logical responses in the sense of like making sense for like her best interest or whatever, but like too much secrecy, too much vagueness, followed by some things that seem a bit random, seem like just too like a bit happenstance, seem like kind of like ad hoc, right? Just kind of like thrown up there, just so you could have something like to say that I chewed on it, right? But not actually being like it's just like a piece of fat that you're chewing on.
Yeah, and it's like why ultimately the kind of melodramatic romance that's also featured in the movie. It's like you never really understand why either one of these people are like drawn to one another. I mean, it's like you can kind of gesture at it, like here's a man showing her some kindness in the same way that she seems to have gotten with her husband because he showed her kindness after she'd been raped by her father, and he is maybe drawn to her as like a version of the person in his past that got hurt that he can actually protect this time. But like that doesn't necessarily scream romance to me, especially, I mean, maybe more so on her part than his part, but like it's kind of just thrown in there because that's how like noirs work, the protagonist and the icy female that he's either working for or tailing or going toe-to-toe with or whatever, they get together and then one of them or both of them end up dead at the end of the movie. So it's it's just it's the movie doing stuff because that's the way that this kind of script would unfold, rather than because it's necessarily the most logical or psychologically verisimilitudinous or artful way that things could could proceed. So it's in some ways a very easy movie to talk about, but it's also difficult because it's like, like what do you say? It's a very competently made piece of Hollywood that gestures at depth in a number of areas, but never really achieves them. Especially compared to some of Polanski's better movies too. I mean, in some ways, it feels kind of like an outlier to some of his other filmography, especially in this era that he was making movies. This was almost like the swan song to like Roman Polanski, the great filmmaker. I mean, does he have a really great movie after this? I mean, you can say Knife in the Water and Repulsion before this, and probably some other stuff that he made in Europe. I haven't seen all of it, but after this, I mean, he's made Pianist, he's made which is again like a competent piece of Hollywood, good Oscar bait. You have a bunch of small stuff like Venus in Furs, or what was that movie with Christoph Waltz where it's like people in an apartment? But he's never really come back from the level of freedom that he had in this movie. I don't think he's ever really pursued the art of saying more with less like he did in his earlier era after he made this.
I've never really been too much of a Roman Polanski film enthusiast to begin with. Well, first of all, are we even allowed to talk about Roman Polanski anymore? I'm surprised they were able to.
It's weird to me that this was screening actually. But I don't. It's at this point it's a classic movie. It's something that almost is pretty much transcended his attachment to it at this point, I would say. Like
if you cancel Rosemary's Baby, you're also canceling Mia Farrow, and that's not going to be allowed.
So it is. I mean, I don't think there's any reason to talk about him. He's a scumbag who got away with something pretty heinous and at this point he's like an 80-something man, and it's probably not useful to engage in a lot of like, you know, bloodthirsty pining for his demise or something, because even cellularly he's not the same person that he was back then. And which is not to say that he escapes culpability, but it's like, you know, even the person that he victimized, I think, doesn't want people bringing it up anymore. So
I wonder if, just on that note, like if we've reached any sort of like stage of moral development where like going forward, you know, nobody's sins would be like, you would have to do a lot of digging, right, to find out that Caravaggio was well, maybe not a lot of digging, but maybe most people wouldn't know just off the top of their heads that Caravaggio was a murderer, right? But most people probably, if they heard the name Roman Polanski, right, they would know, partly because like it's going to be in connection with this event anyway, right, or these events, right? But I wonder if we have reached a stage, or will eventually reach some stage, where this sort of personal background, whether it's like murder or like anything, whatever, whether it's always a kind of like it's not allowed to be not part of someone's historical record, even if like they, I don't know, let's say they murder someone and yet they find a universal cure for cancer that goes in the market and it's like $5 and you're cured of cancer 100%, right? Like, so that kind of saving, right? Like what exactly will happen in terms of the moral treatment of these sorts of characters who, you know, they have talents, right? They have things they've contributed to the world. They must be most likely, with enough the passage of time, you know, Caravaggio is likely a net positive to the world, right? You can't really easily run that experiment, but, you know, I have an instinct that that's probably the case, right? To what extent is that no longer simply going to be just the analysis, or are we simply going to like always just be where we always are, right? Because it's just like contemporaneous screeching, or is this going to have like actual long-term ramifications?
It's too soon to say, I think.
Yeah, but you got to make your position now, and then you have to either eat crow or take credit for it.
Well, I mean, ultimately I was saying to you earlier, art is wonderful, but it is also, especially any given work of art, it is also optional. I mean, we probably should not say that. I mean, there's been a lot of abuse that's been perpetuated in this world in the last few millennia under the aegis of greatness or genius or things like that. And certainly, I would say it's a sign of moral progress if we at least, you know, put a pause on this, on that sort of act of excuse making. You know, at the same time, you know, I do think you should be able to talk about the achievements of a person like divorced from the bad that they commit, you know. I mean, in the case of someone like Polanski, the complication is that he's continued to make money and sort of be a lauded person even after he committed a pretty heinous rape of a 13-year-old girl.
Is he? I mean, does he get a lot of positive attention these days? I mean, he
got a standing ovation at the Oscars for The Pianist. So, I mean, that was like 2002, something. I
don't think that would happen again now.
Well, it wouldn't happen again right now, but
like,
when he got arrested in what 2013, 2014. So,
what was that about?
Well, he got, because he's had a arrest warrant out in the U.S. for decades.
Yeah, I remember.
And he went into some country that has an extradition treaty with the U.S. and he got arrested. And a bunch of Hollywood people signed a petition, that, from what I recall, the content of the petition was basically saying, I honestly can't remember if it was just, irrespective of his crimes, we believe Roman Polanski is a great filmmaker and worthy of respect or something like that, or if it was actually saying that he should be released. But there was quite a lot of high up respected people in Hollywood that signed that petition either way, that now are getting quite a lot of side eye from sexual violence or anti-sexual violence activists and kind of up and coming, more socially social justice inclined younger creators and financiers and producers and creatives and things like that. So, you know, I think it's hard to say which way it's going to go. I think that probably it is eventually going to settle on a lower temperature than it is currently at. You know, I mean, it does seem like there's, like, for as heinous as some of this stuff is, there's almost like a melodramatic degree to which, like, people pursue it, you know, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe melodramatic is not the word, but, like, you know, like, there's almost a way where you can't even, like, unless you talk about it like this person is like the spawn of Satan, then you're somehow not being serious about it. And I tend to think that degree of, like, vitriol and passion will probably diffuse somewhat over time, maybe go from like a 10 where and even then you kind of already seen it, you know. I mean, both of the candidates in the last presidential election were to varying degrees of credibility accused of sexual assault, and yet that didn't impact how many votes either one of them got, you know. And you're sort of seeing you're seeing the temperature turn down on it a bit already. I think it's maybe going to be kind of go to a point of a low boil instead of a rolling vigorous boil, you know.
Yeah, we can't, you know, it's never going to be like, you know, like a toleration of, well, I mean, it's toleration until people are fearful of something happening, someone getting caught.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the other part of it, right? I think a lot of these things maybe would have to be more subtle. But you can't return to the kind of like more flagrant days, right? Kind of like in anything, I feel like a lot of stuff is under the microscope, which, you know, a lot of that is good, right?
Yeah.
You want a lot of shit under the microscope, so, you know, that trend, that overall trend strikes me as pretty healthy.
Yeah. And like most things, I mean, things always swing to an extreme before they kind of snap back and settle into a more socially healthy, like a regular metabolism.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a new enzyme being introduced into the digestive process. You know, it may in one generation be like an unhealthy mutation. You know, it may be something that actually interferes with healthy metabolic processes, but, you know, it provides some sort of genetic advantage, and then maybe it settles into like a lower state of prevalence as it sort of gets winnowed into a more fit state of being, you know.
Right. Well, I said you have to stake out a position and you have to take credit or eat crow.
Well, what is there to stake?
Well, but I only said that just for you to talk about it, right? But I'm not going to take. In fact, if you do want to hear me stake out a position and either take credit or eat crow, you're going to have to sign up to the Patreon.
Yeah, that's true.
Patreon.com/show-to-machination. Should we record some sort of like little, like, I don't know, bonus conversation after this for the patrons?
Yeah, it's probably a good thing to have in your pocket.
Maybe like a 15-20 minute after show.
Yeah.
Where we just talk some shit, right? Because Washington Square Park, and we wanna get out of here. But automachination.com for all your literary needs.
Yes.
Patreon.com/automachination so you can support everything that we do. Once we hit $500 a month, right? I'm gonna upload videos of myself every month working in real time on my various artworks, right? So a lot of you guys, right, you're always like, damn, I wish I had this or that artist notebook, right? Because you're still struggling maybe. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat that it's worthless, right? It's not, you only want it because you're struggling. It's not actually going to help you. But since I know that you want it, I'm going to fucking feed that habit, all right? Patreon.com/show-to-machination, right? And we're going to feed that habit. So thank you guys for watching. This was MovieMacro number 2. Hit like, hit subscribe. And yeah, we're going to come back with a patron-only bonus show. Bye.
Bye-bye.